Would you like to play some football?
Hi, and welcome to another edition of Gridiron and the Gospel, a faith and college football podcast. I'm George Schroeder.
And I'm Brad Edwards. And normally this time of year, teams start to lose and it kind of clarifies the playoff picture. At least that's the way it was in the 4-team model. Now with 12 teams, it seems like the upsets that we saw this past Saturday have just muddled the picture even more. So we're going to get into that here.
I mean, and by the way, before we get into it, does that make it better for you or worse for you, Brad?
In a way, George, I think it makes it better. This might be more fun. We'll see.
I do too. All right. So there were several upsets that probably, you could have, I don't know if it's upsets, but maybe it's massive results, right? A couple of upsets. Ole Miss beating Georgia and then beating them the way they did it, 28-10. I mean, owning the game is not something anybody saw. You might have seen Ole Miss winning.
Right.
But you didn't see 28-10. And if you did, I'd really like for you to, toot your own horn because I don't believe you. Alabama 42, LSU 13. I probably thought Alabama was the better team. I did think that and would win the game even at Tiger Stadium, Death Valley at Saturday night. But I didn't see 42-13. Georgia Tech 28, Miami 23. That is an upset. No question. And it's one of those things our friend Reese Davis, friend of the pod, would say is if you're not good enough, a loss will find you.
Eventually find you. And it did.
Almost no one is good enough to go unbeaten. This doesn't mean Miami's not going to the playoff. They're still right there. This doesn't mean they're not good enough to do a lot of things in the playoff. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying if you're not good enough or when you're not good enough, a loss will find you. And I credit Reese for that. And then late, I'm sure all of you stayed up there last night in Salt Lake City at Utah, BYU, with an unbelievable sequence near the end. I did stay up late. Wins 22-21 with a last-second field goal that left Utah's athletic director so mad he was lecturing officials on the way off the field. Then he came into the media room and basically blasted the officiating and the Big 12 conference, which is unheard of for athletic directors to do, and then got fined and issued a semi-apology
$40,000
by statement. $40,000 fine, which is actually a little more significant for
for
Harlan
an AD,
than it is,
right? Yeah,
than it is for say a coach or a quarterback or something. And I'm kidding, but it may not be that significant for a quarterback these days. Who knows? It's definitely not significant for a coach. So those were the big, really wild results. I guess we should start in Oxford, Mississippi.
Yeah.
Where it rained and rained and rained and rained, and Ole Miss made Georgia look really mortal, which is not, I'm going to say this, 28-10, right? None of us expected that. But Georgia, aside from maybe the second half of the Alabama game, when they made that furious comeback and couldn't quite pull it off because Alabama had the big first half lead, and then what they did in Austin when they were on their A game, Georgia has not looked like what we've come to expect from Georgia over the past few years this year at all. Maybe we should have seen this coming, but it was still shocking to me to watch unfold. 28-10 in the rain in Oxford. What a great night to be a Rebels fan, and what a comeback to earth moment for Georgia.
Yeah, I agree with what you said earlier, which is that it was not surprising to see Ole Miss win the game. How easily they won it is what was really shocking. Last weekend, if you watched Georgia, I believe tied with about 6 minutes left in the game or so against Florida, you could see this is still Georgia struggling to find a way to bring that A game on a consistent basis. And then you see Ole Miss hanging 60 on Arkansas and Fayetteville. And you're like, okay, if those two teams show up next week in Oxford, Ole Miss is winning. And that's pretty much what happened. Those versions showed up. Now, the Ole Miss offense, and look, maybe part of this is because the quarterback was injured on the first play of the game. You end up with an interception that turns into a quick Georgia touchdown. Georgia's up 7-0. And then after that, it was all Ole Miss. And I would think the part that was most surprising is that Georgia only managed 3 points after that opening short field touchdown drive. I mean, the fact that Ole Miss scored 28, not surprising, but the 10 for Georgia was. And now we're in a position where I mean, you tell me what I'm expecting to see Georgia's A game this coming weekend.
Yeah,
because it seems like we saw at Texas, backs against the wall when they
talking
had
about at Tennessee, right? Or Tennessee?
No, Tennessee in Athens.
Right.
Okay, but the previous time Georgia's back was kind of against the wall, people were doubting them. They brought it. I think they'll bring it again this weekend. But the big question is that if that's who you are, can you win the national championship? If it, can you bring it 3 weeks in a row against that caliber of competition to win it?
Before you go there, Brad.
Yeah.
I think it's worth noting that they scored 10 points, as you said, but it is worth an underscore or a highlight. I don't know how you do that with audio other than me coming back and repeating it, that they scored 1 touchdown on a short field.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have sustained drives. They just really never got anything going on offense. A short field after an interception early. And then after that, a field goal. Their offense was, and look, Ole Miss doesn't get a lot of credit for this. They've got a nice defensive line.
Very good.
But Georgia, one of the things they've been able to do is, under Kirby Smart, is grind you and get the run game going, which opens up the pass game. They've been the run first to set up the pass type of thing. And they're not able to do that. So their O-line is not controlling the line of scrimmage. It was really shocking, which feeds into the what does this portend for them, which is where you were, right?
Yeah.
I think they'll have their A game ready against Tennessee. One, it's a big opponent. And two, their backs are clearly against the wall as it relates to even getting into the playoff. Now, with 2 losses, they're not getting in with 3 because there's too many others in their own league that might have 2 losses at the end of the year. And so they can't afford another loss to Tennessee or anywhere else. I don't know what it means, though. Even if they get into the playoff, I don't know that they're a team I would pick to win the thing at this point.
Not what they've been for the majority of the games they've played. As you mentioned, we've basically
win a bunch in a row in a playoff.
We've seen their A game for a total of about 8 quarters. Okay, you had the 4 quarters against Texas. That start to finish, that was a pretty dominant performance. Mm-hmm. The second half against Clemson, the season opener. Second half against Alabama, and that's right. They might have had a random quarter here and there. But for the most part, they have not looked like a national championship caliber team. We know at their very best, they're capable of beating anyone. But the question is it realistic to expect them to be able to do that, to be able to just flip that switch and do it 3 games in a row to win the whole thing? I don't know. And so before I move on to the Ole Miss side of this, which I think we need to hit on, let me ask you this question. If I had told you before the season that in the middle of November that Georgia would be ranked behind Indiana and BYU, what would you have thought?
You were talking about basketball. You got the wrong poll. And how did Georgia get into the basketball poll?
That's right.
That's what I would have said.
And that's the crazy thing is you looked at, Georgia is just outside of the top 10 of the AP poll, which is strange enough to see as good as they've been in the last few years. But then you look up in front of them and you see BYU and Indiana, among others. You see a Notre Dame team that lost to Northern Illinois ahead of them. So it just says a lot about how inconsistent they've been and how few people really believe in them right now. And you know what? That's when they seem to play their best, is when nobody believes in them. So we'll see if we're right about Georgia flipping that switch, at least for this coming Saturday.
Yeah. Can I say one thing? Since you sent me over to the AP poll, we're going to talk about it in a little bit. But how weird is it to see, now, first of all, go with me that these teams are in the Big Ten, because it's weird that Oregon's in the Big Ten. But how weird is it to see 4 of the top 5 teams are Big Ten teams? Oregon and Ohio State, then Texas from the SEC, which is still weird to say, and then Penn State and Indiana at number 5. How weird is that? And given the way the season's played out, no quibble with that, at least this week.
And look, obviously it doesn't mean anything, but it is strange to see it. And of course, I think one of the reasons we see it is that we have this imbalance with scheduling. And I don't think we expected it to be as glaring as it is. that there's so many of these teams that miss for them, the right teams within their conference. And there are just so few head-to-heads among the very best teams. Ohio State's the one that got the tough schedule. They were at Oregon and at Penn State. Then, coming up next, they'll play Indiana, or at least coming up next for Indiana. I think Ohio State has another game in between. But the rest of them all got a pretty good draw in conference play, and that's why they're sitting right there, is because there aren't a lot of head-to-heads. So going back to Ole Miss, because I just want to point this out, since taking that job, Lane Kiffin has got a lot of attention because he's a guy who got a lot of attention before he became.
But he also
the Ole Miss
works
coach.
to get a lot of attention.
He does.
He tries to gain attention.
He certainly does.
Very Lane Kiffin of him.
And they had up until this season, I think mostly had a Penn State type of trajectory where they were often a top 10 team, but not good enough to beat Georgia and Alabama and become a top. Like, they couldn't knock off the very best teams. They did that this weekend with Georgia. They got the win that Penn State has not yet found a way to get. And now, no, I'm not going to say they're off the ropes. They're still on the ropes. They can't afford to lose again. But when it mattered, they went out, they won that game. They won it in decisive fashion. And I don't know what their chances are of making the SEC championship game, which is a big deal for Ole Miss because they're one of the few teams that's never actually made it to Atlanta to that game. But in this 12-team playoff format, given that they have wins over now Georgia and LSU, and I'm sorry, no, they lost to LSU. Who was the other one they had? They beat, I guess it was South Carolina. That's probably their second best win. So maybe it's just the Georgia win. I don't know. For whatever reason, maybe it's just the eye test. I feel, and I still can't explain how they lost at home to Kentucky, but Ole Miss feels like they're one of the 12 best teams. And if they don't lose the rest of the way, I think they got a really good shot to be in this playoff. And so that next step, I think they just took it. They've got to close it out. They can't go to Gainesville and lose or anything like that. But if they take care of business, I think they're in the playoff. And so I just wanted to make that point that, and look, and they did it through working the portal. I mean, they got a lot of transfers on that roster. Many of them are impact players, and they've made the difference. And I think it's going to end up getting them into the playoff.
Yeah, their next best win is at South Carolina, 27-3, which is a good win given.
Which is another one that,
that
like the Georgia win. It's not just they beat Georgia; they beat them 28-10. South Carolina, what was it, 27-3 in Columbia? And you look at what South Carolina has done just about every other game. They're a pretty good team. I wouldn't be surprised if they're in the committee's top 25 this week. To go into that place and beat them as handily as they did, nobody else has managed to do that. And so I don't know. I think Ole Miss is a very good team, and like I said, I expect to see them in the playoff.
All right, Alabama 42, LSU 13. Big showdown in the Bayou, whatever. Depends on where you are. Jalen Milroe's still running free. As we keep seeing field storming this year by excited students, I saw a photograph taken by one of the Alabama media contingent with the snarky comment. This had been in the fourth quarter. LSU students are storming the parking lots.
Yeah, they
Picture
were.
of empty stands. So first, this Alabama team is what it is. I don't have a ton of confidence that they're like a team I would pick to win the national title, but they sure look like a playoff team based on what they're pulling off and where they sit. It'd be hard. I mean, could they lay an egg somewhere? I don't think so at this point. Feels like they're potentially a playoff team in the playoff. Then that'd be the first thing I would say. But I want to talk about LSU because LSU fans are notoriously fickle. They expect a ton, maybe more than they should, but they expect a ton, and the program has achieved a ton under various coaches. 3 different coaches now have won national titles. It's not just Nick Saban.
Right.
Way back in the day, right? Yeah, the last 3. It's Les Miles and Ed Ogeron of all people have won national titles. And they brought in Brian Kelly because Scott Woodward is a splash hire guy. He's also the guy that hired Jimbo Fisher at Texas A&M and paid him so much money. But Scott Woodward, now the LSU AD, brought Brian Kelly in from Notre Dame, and it's been a weird fit. From the day he affected that fake Cajun accent when he showed up at the basketball game after he got hired. And, but it just, My question is this. Do you think this is one of those moments in time when it's not that you lose to Alabama, although that's bad if you're an LSU fan, even now that Nick Saban's gone, right? It's not that you lose to Alabama. It's that at home, with lots of things to play for, with what you think is momentum, instead you get drilled by an Alabama team that isn't the Alabama teams of 3, 4, 5 years ago and has had its own struggles this year. Is this one of those things that we'll look back on that's, I don't know if it's a pivot point, but it's at least an inflection point in a, is this the right guy for the program type of discussion? That's my
Yeah, I mean,
question to you.
this is another game like the previous one we discussed where it was not surprising that Alabama won. It was surprising how much they won by and how easy it was. And if you weren't watching all the way to the end, LSU's lone touchdown came in the closing seconds against Alabama's backups. And I would have never believed that that was possible, that Alabama, the way that they have played defense for most of this season, would have been able to keep LSU out of the end zone for almost a full 4 quarters. LSU I still believe, is a good offensive team. I don't know what happened. Obviously, what's going to make headlines is how bad the defense was for the second game in a row at stopping quarterback run, and especially after Jalen Milroe had done that to them last year. So it was the combination of the previous game at A&M and then also a year earlier against Alabama. You'd figure that was the number one thing they had to have focused on, not getting beaten by.
Well, I think they did. In all due respect to the coaching staff, I don't know that they had prepared for Marcel Reed when he came in and the second half of that loss to A&M.
Yeah, coming off the bench.
They prepared for Connor Wegman, and it makes sense. Although you think you might prepare because what if Wegman gets hurt, right? At least
and Reed had started a few games. You had film on him, et cetera. Yeah.
But there's no question you prepared for what Jalen can do. Here's the difference. It didn't matter. I mean, he's a lot better running quarterback at this point in his career, and maybe ever, than Marcel Reed is. And so it just didn't matter. So they at least, whatever they did, the Texas A&M game, did or didn't do to prepare, they were prepared, air quotes, for what Alabama was going to throw at them. They just weren't prepared they just weren't able to actually stop it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let me go back to answer the question that you asked, because I was kind of introing it and I never got to.
Trying not to answer it is what you're doing.
No, I'm not. I actually want to answer this question. But I think as much as it looked like this team was completely unprepared on both sides of the ball in a game in which their season was hanging in the balance, I mean, with a win, they're probably going to end up in the SEC championship game. A loss not only kills that, but it also kills any chance of making the 12-team playoff, and that's where they are now.
Right.
I just happen to think, number one, I think Brian Kelly's a very good head coach, and we can argue about fit and all that stuff, but I think he's a better coach than Ed Ogeron. I think he's a better coach than Les Miles. And there's no reason that Brian Kelly shouldn't have a really good chance to win a national championship if he stays at LSU for a few more years. In this era of transfers, you can change a roster pretty quickly. LSU has improved on defense. As bad as it looked in the previous game against Alabama, they're much better on defense than they were a year ago. It was kind of hard not to get better. But I think they will recruit well enough to continue to get better on that side of the ball. And look, they have he signs coming up next month, arguably the top quarterback in the country coming out of high school. Will be there on their roster next year. We have seen in the past few years them bring in transfer quarterbacks, Jaden Daniels and Joe Burrow, who obviously led two elite offenses, two of the best offenses we've seen in college football, maybe ever. And so it can change very quickly if you just have the right guy behind center. LSU's going to have the athletes everywhere else on offense that if the quarterback is there, and I don't think Nussmeier's a bad quarterback. He's not playing very well right now.
No, but when he makes lots of plays, but when he makes mistakes, they're killers.
They are. So, but the bottom line is I think LSU, as bad as this looks right now, 2 years from now, could easily be a top 5 team, national title contender, and it wouldn't surprise me.
I don't disagree. The question is this kind of inflection point where the fans turn? Because at a place like LSU, and that maybe wasn't exactly the question, but that was what I'm trying to get at. So, because they are notoriously quick at LSU. It doesn't mean it always happens quickly, but they're notoriously quick. It's what have you done for me lately? And in Brian Kelly's case, he hasn't done anything for them based on what they think they're supposed to have.
Let me just add this, which is that even though, it's not Nick Saban anymore, they're used to losing to Alabama, and they're used to losing at home under the lights to Alabama. I mean, nobody else beats LSU.
I'm going to clip that and tweet it for you.
It is true. Every LSU fan will tell you that. They are used to losing at night at Tiger Stadium to Alabama. Nobody else comes in there and beats them, but Alabama does it on a regular basis. And this, George, this isn't just under Saban and now DeBoer. This is going back to 1970. Alabama owns that stadium. So I think when LSU fans, now, of course, they're upset, but I think when LSU fans would really start to turn on Brian Kelly is if someone other than Alabama or other than a Georgia in the way that they've been the last few years were to do that to them, then it's like, okay, what is going on here? And look, I would advise Brian Kelly not lose another game the rest of the regular season because the schedule says that he shouldn't. But if he rights the ship and they finish 9-3, I don't, it'll be slightly disappointing. But considering they lost the opener to USC, I think LSU fans were kind of prepared a while back to not be in the playoff this year. And so 9-3, all when all said and done, might be disappointing, but it's not going to be tragic.
Well, all right. I hear what you're saying. I think you're giving LSU fans a little more credit than I will. I don't think they're used to losing. I mean, yes, it happens, but I don't think they're used to losing to Alabama. So I hear what you're saying.
They are. Look at the scores.
I'm not. It's clearly happened, but that doesn't mean that they've ever gotten used to it.
I'm not saying they like it. I'm just saying that it's not a shock to their system.
To them. No, but it's unacceptable to them.
The margin was absolutely unacceptable.
Losing is unacceptable to them, but losing 42-13 is shocking and unacceptable to them. It's the margin against a mortal, not immortal, but a mortal Alabama team.
For sure.
So, all right, what did we learn about Alabama?
I think what we learned is that, first of all, Alabama's defense might be improving. I hesitate to take too much away from the shutout they had of Missouri the game before, just because of Missouri's quarterback situation. They were facing a backup who, basically Alabama's starting defense has now gone 2 straight games in the SEC without allowing a touchdown. So moving forward, if they can play better defense, I think they've got a chance to beat anybody on a given day, which we've seen. Offensively, though, I think what we saw is that they've learned a lesson, maybe from the Tennessee game, which is that even though he did hit some big passes against Georgia, you don't want Jalen Milroe throwing the ball 40 plus times in a game. That's what happened in Knoxville. And he was not on target that day, and it ended up being a wreck. And now look, Tennessee has a good defense, better than LSU's. But I think what we saw was a little bit of a different strategy from Alabama, which is that they were going to try to establish the run with the running backs. They were going to use the short passing game, and they were going to, instead of constantly looking for the big play downfield, we're just going to move the chains and eventually, find the spots to run Milroe and get some big plays, or at least get some pivotal first downs on a third down run. And they managed to do that. And I think that's why it was so easy for them, is because they pretty much stayed ahead of the chains. They stayed in, third and short, third and manageable for most of the night, which is something that they had a lot of games recently that they had not been successful at doing. And so can they keep this up? Will that work against the next good defense they face? I don't know, but it was definitely a different change of approach offensively. And I think I think that everything worked really well on this night, and it certainly allowed Milroe to be at his best.
Mm-hmm. Well, it'll be interesting to see where we go from there. But clearly, Alabama now, back where you expect Alabama to be in the conversation, firmly in the conversation. So,
yeah. So, last thing on that before we leave the SEC, which I think we're about to do. I want to say we mentioned this last week, but just in case we didn't, the SEC now is a complete mess. If you look at the standings, so LSU took a third loss. They kind of fall out of it. But with Ole Miss beating Georgia, now you've got a bunch of 2-loss teams. So Georgia, Ole Miss. This is not in conference. This is just overall record.
Mm-hmm.
Georgia, Ole Miss, Alabama all have 2 losses, along with Texas A&M and Missouri. Still sitting there with 1 loss are Texas and Tennessee. So if Tennessee loses at Georgia this week, which most people expect to happen, add Tennessee to that list, and then if Texas were to lose at Texas A&M at the end of the season, there are no other head-to-head meetings between these top teams left. So in theory, they could all win out, with the exception of Georgia beating Tennessee and Texas A&M beating Texas. If that happens, you have 7 SEC teams finish 10-2. What is the selection committee going to do with that? The other question people ask, what are the SEC tiebreakers going to do with that as far as who gets into the conference championship game? If that scenario plays out, there'll be 1 team with only a single conference loss.
That's the mess of this whole deal. So, is because of the imbalanced schedules, how do you pull this off? And
so basically,
it's going to be bad.
I have not gone through it myself. I will wait until Tennessee loses to Georgia to confirm this. But based on what I've seen from other people, it appears that if Tennessee loses at Georgia, then with all those teams tied at 2 losses in the SEC, Alabama is the one that would win the tiebreakers and would face probably the Texas A&M winner in the SEC championship game. I still feel like there's likely to be an upset somewhere. Somebody's going to choke, and it's going to throw off the tiebreakers and everything. But as it sits right now, if the favorites win, that's kind of what we're looking at. And crazy to see the possibility of that happening.
Third-team quarterback's mother's maiden name as the tiebreakers kind of thing. We're going to be going down to the second tiebreaker on this stuff. It's crazy. And that's the problem with these big conferences, with the elimination of divisions, because you have to, and just the imbalanced schedules, the unbalanced schedules within the leagues, never mind outside the leagues. All right, we mentioned this on the outset, but Miami rolled into Atlanta and wobbled out with their first loss, 28-23 at the hands of the rambling wreck from Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech did a nice job on Cam Ward.
They did.
Nobody else has been able to really do that, but they did a nice job on Cam Ward. And I got to be honest with you, Miami looks like a team. They're a playoff team to me. They look like a playoff team. I think they'll win enough games to be in the playoff chase, or be in the playoff field when we get to the end of that here in a few weeks. But as I look at them, I'm like, they are so dependent on otherworldly things being done by Cam Ward that he masks a lot of deficiencies they have. That Georgia Tech team is pretty pedestrian. Let's be honest.
They're average. I mean, the standings show you that. They're an average ACC team.
I mean, that's the kind of team, yes, it's you're going on the road in conference. It's not necessarily easy thing to do, but that's the kind of game you handle.
And that's not one of the tougher places to play either. Yeah.
You win by 10 or 14 or something like that. You maybe, if you're having a really bad day, you escape it. But you don't lose. But as Reese Davis will say, if you're not good enough, a loss will find you. And that's what happened to Miami, which I think, it doesn't mean they're not getting in the playoff. I still think they're getting the playoff. But if you were dreaming, Miami fans, Dean and Sarah, if you were dreaming, Miami fans, that this is the year you could win the playoff, and I don't think Dean was, I would be revising my expectations. That's what I take from that loss. Doesn't kill you because of the 12-team playoff thing, but I'd be revising my expectations for what can be achieved based on that.
Yeah. Yeah, look, and I think Miami fans are all scratching their heads about the defense. Like, how are they so ineffective? They have dudes. Like, you look at them, they don't have a lot of guys out there that you would say, okay, this is who you pick on if you go against them. Right. Like, they all look like they can play, but for whatever reason, seems like every other play somebody misses an assignment, and just about everybody has been able to move the ball on them, at least in conference play. And that's why they end up in these games week in and week out, where Cam Ward has to be Superman in order for them to win. And in this case, he wasn't able to do it. As you said, Georgia Tech had a great plan for him. They managed to keep him in the pocket. They kept him under constant pressure. He was not able to ad lib and make as many big plays as he normally does. And they lost the game. And I think I said it a few weeks ago. I felt like, as soon as Miami played a team with a good defensive front, I said this when we were really discussing the playoff. Like, are they a legitimate national title contender? And I said, as soon as they play someone with a good defensive front, they're going to lose because the running game's not going to go anywhere. And if Ward is under pressure without having to blitz him, then they're not going to be able to score 40, which is what it's going to take for them to win. So now, look, where it sits right now, once again, based on what I've seen, even though Miami and Clemson don't play each other, the tiebreaker is in Miami's favor. So if Miami wins out, I believe they're in the ACC championship game. And at this point, though, here's what's changed, George, is now they may have to win the ACC championship game to get into the playoff. Whereas if they had gotten there undefeated and then lost, they're probably in the playoff anyway. So,
I mean, we may be looking at one ACC team here.
Yeah, look, if Miami loses again,
right,
or if SMU were to lose to someone in the next couple of weeks and then beat Miami, that is possible. But yeah, I mean, look, they're fun to watch, but they're either going to take a second loss and not get into the playoff, or if they do get in, they've got one and done written all over them just because that defense just is putting way too much pressure on the offense to play at such a high level.
Yeah, agreed. So I don't really want to spend a lot of time on BYU Utah, the holy war as they style it out there in Utah, but because we talked about it at the top, really.
Yeah.
But if you haven't and you have the opportunity, go back and watch the final 2 minutes of that game. It was frenetic, and really the last drive with what the Utah AD thought was some questionable officiating and things like that. They moved down the field and kicked a field goal as time expired without any timeouts. And fascinating game because it was a game that BYU was finally going to lose. That loss was going to find them. And instead they won. And I don't remember who it was, but one of my former colleagues, might have been Pat Forty, tweeted 2024 BYU is 2022 TCU after the game. And it's that kind of charmed thing, right? TCU famously had a fire drill field goal in the final seconds to win at Baylor in 2022. And it was a mediocre Baylor team that finished the year 6-7 after a bowl loss. And, Utah's not having a typical Utah year, mostly because of injuries, but they're not the same team. And so that was a game BYU coulda, woulda, shoulda lost. And it just, they're not losing. And I mean, good for them. It's fun, but now BYU is unbeaten. I think there are how many unbeatens are there now? There's Army, who that's the one Army reference probably for this podcast today.
Yeah.
There's BYU. There's Oregon, the number one team in the polls.
There's Indiana.
And there's Indiana. That's it. That's the four teams that are unbeaten in major college football right now. Pretty amazing. So,
yeah. And so look, where I go with that is that because they're undefeated, what does that mean for the selection committee? And I think the question that everybody wants to know is if BYU can do what Miami failed to do and stay undefeated into the conference championship game, are they in at that point? Does the Big 12 have a chance to be a two-team league or two teams into the playoff league if BYU can just get to the conference championship game undefeated? And then obviously they'd have to be upset. I'm not sure it would be a major upset, but whether it be Colorado or Kansas State, if they get knocked off, does that mean a second Big 12 team would get in, or that BYU would actually get in as the second team? I don't know. I mean, they certainly you could question if they're not a conference champion, are they one of the 12 best teams? But here's another thing, George, though. I mean, I'm looking at this right now. I'm looking at this week's AP poll. The top 15 teams, to me, unquestionably, are all still in the playoff hunt. But I go beyond 15. I'm not sure any of those teams are really still in it.
Well,
realistically, now Colorado
it has to win the Big 12, and they're in position to go to the amazingly enough, Coach Prime's team is in position at 7-2, and what are they? They have one
Yeah.
loss, I guess, in league play.
Colorado is the only one in there that I would say has a direct path in that if they win the rest of their games, it would require
They'll win the conference title.
Yeah, they'll win the conference title, and that
game.
will put them in.
Right.
Army, I mean, I guess you could say the same thing for Army, but Army would have to beat Notre Dame in South Bend as one of those wins. Just going undefeated through conference is not going to get it for them. The rest of them, I think, are pretty much out in the cold.
But,
and so kind of where I'm going with this, though, is that I don't think that there are enough teams that are still legitimate contenders. And assuming that some of them do get upset, some of the ones in the top, I mean, I'm not talking about Tennessee losing to Georgia or Indiana losing to Ohio State. I'm talking about the unexpected loss somewhere. Assuming that one or two of those still happen, it very well could be a case where if BYU just manages to get to 12-0, that there's no way that one loss in a conference title game is going to knock them all the way out of the top 12. Right. That's a possibility.
Well, that'll be one of those early tests. We don't know. We've never seen a 12-team playoff with this many at-large possibilities and all that kind of thing. So all of it's new to us. But that does take you to one of the questions that you want to ask. And you just gave your answer. How many teams, looking at the AP top 25, which is not the same thing as the selection committee rankings, right, but those also are supposed to be meaningless this time of year. But just looking at the AP top 25, we record this on Sunday nights. AP top 25 comes out on Sunday morning, so that makes it easy to look at. By the time you listen to this, it's possible that it's past Tuesday night and the next set of playoff rankings are out. Looking at the AP top 25, Brad, you think the top 15 are all firmly in the playoff chase, plus Colorado, which is 18th, only because Colorado at 7-2, more importantly, its Big 12 record would say they have the inside track if they can keep winning to the conference title game and that's the path, is to be a conference champion.
Yeah, and then if Kansas, if Colorado were to fail to do that, then Kansas State takes that spot where...
So you got 17 here, basically. 17 with a shot. You've got the top 15, then you've got Colorado at 18 and Kansas State currently at 20 because of the paths they might have into the Big 12 championship game. That's what you got, 17.
Well, so
with a legitimate
Kansas State,
in the picture.
Kansas State needs an upset. They need someone to beat Colorado.
Right. But
by the same token, Clemson needs an upset. Clemson needs someone else to beat Miami.
Right.
If that happens, then Clemson all of a sudden has new life, and then Miami is probably out.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm getting at is that there are not, like, I expected middle of November. You know, if we were talking about back at the beginning of the season and we're all speculating on how the expanded playoff is going to look and what effect it's going to have on the end of the regular season, I would have thought that there would be a lot more meaningful games than it looks like there will be. I don't think there's many teams that are still legitimately in it as I expected, and there aren't as many head-to-heads among the teams that are in it as I would have thought that there would be. You know, because, I mean, outside of Ohio State and Indiana playing, Georgia and Tennessee playing, and then Texas and A&M playing, I don't think there's another head-to-head anywhere within the top 15. That's it. Now, that certainly, look, we've watched the sport long enough to know that doesn't mean that two or three others won't choke somewhere, right, and change all the calculations. But it does set up where there's a possibility that there might not be a whole lot of drama down the stretch, except for maybe just some argument over, who kind of gets that very last spot, that last at-large spot.
Well, it's still amazing, though. It's just, let me put it this way. If it's 15 or 17 or whatever the number is, and it's November 10th today on Sunday, we're going into the week of the Saturday of November 16th, and we're saying there are 17 teams still like firmly in the chase. And obviously some of these others still would have some path if crazy things happen. That's exactly what they wanted when they expanded the playoff. And it's exactly what we didn't have with 4 teams.
Yeah, where there may have been, 8 teams left at this stage?
Yep.
8 or 9?
Yep.
And every week that went by, that number dwindled to where you go into the final weekend. It was, at best case, it was 6, right?
As one example, after winning in a crazy game, and we don't really have time to talk about how it happened, but after beating Oklahoma with some late craziness on both ends. Like the last 3 minutes were crazy.
If you haven't seen it, by the way, if you didn't see the highlight, pull up the box score and just look at the scoring summary. You'll probably want to watch the highlight after seeing that. But yeah, it was nuts.
After Missouri surrendered the lead and then regained and then tied it and then regained the lead with craziness and won against a depleted OU team we've talked a little bit about, and found their way back into the or at least into the top 25 again at number 24 at 7-2. Wouldn't be in Brad's you can make the playoff deal. Eli Drinkwitz said, this just keeps us in the playoff chase. And I'm just going to say, look, Eli, love you, appreciate you. Keep thinking that. Enjoy.
Hey, what is he supposed to say, though? I mean, look, as I mentioned earlier, there could be 7 SEC teams finish 10-2, but if that happened, Missouri would be the last in line. They would be the 7th of the 7 as far as likelihood of getting into the playoff. Their 2 losses were they both shutouts? Or did they? I think they might have scored against A&M, but they got absolutely run out of the stadium twice in their 2 losses.
They don't pass the eye test at this point.
And their best win, I believe, is against Vanderbilt at this point. Although if they were to win at South Carolina this weekend, which I believe is where they play, that would become their best win. But I just don't think there's anything on the resume to justify putting them in at 10-2 because they're not going to be in the SEC championship game.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, hey, we probably should get to. There is a big game, right? Which only guarantees that something weird will happen elsewhere. But Tennessee at Georgia. We referred to it earlier, but you're looking forward to that game. I take it, Brad. I know I am. It'll be fun to see what can happen there. Although, as we record this, do we have an update on Nico? You can say his last name's status.
Oliava?
Yeah.
Josh Heupel said after the game that he kind of indicated that he's okay. So as of now, we're expecting him to play. I believe what he said is it was precautionary to keep him out for the end of the game. They had a big lead over Mississippi State. No need to risk it. Now, that said, George, we remember what happened last year with Florida State when it was known that their starting quarterback was out for the season and they didn't get into the college football playoff because of it. I'm not saying that's the case right here. He may start at Georgia and this is, end of discussion. But I'm just saying whether it's Tennessee or someone else, if you think your team has a chance to be in the college football playoff and might end up in that conversation as an at-large, if you don't have to reveal that one of your key players is out for the season, you don't do it because we know what that can turn into. So this is not a conspiracy theory. I'm just saying after what happened last year, if I'm a coach, even if my guy is out, I'm not letting anybody know how serious it is because I at least want everyone to think there's a possibility he could be back for the first round of the playoffs. So that said, I expect him to play and I expect Georgia is going to bring their A game and Georgia wins this one easily. But
there's a pick that wasn't even asked for. There we go.
But you know what, George? Tennessee has one of the best defenses in college football. And Georgia's offense has, this is no secret. They've been struggling. So, I kind of pose this as Georgia's going to blow them out. How many points can Georgia really score, though? Is 24 kind of what you would see as like the max?
No, so, I think Georgia could get on track and get going. So
okay, all right.
I'm not going to I think Georgia's going to win that.
I will be very surprised if Tennessee wins this game. I'll just say that.
All right, so we are making some picks though. This is if I get this right, the 9th round of our competition. Maybe I'm wrong on that. How many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Yeah.
I guess it is the 9th round of our competition where we are competing. Each week we pick a team that we are saying is going to make the playoff. And we're starting to get a little concerned about some of our picks that we've already made. And this is where I should remind you, if you're competing with us, remember to send your pick to gridirongospelpod@gmail.com by Wednesday each week. By Wednesday, we assume that, if there's action going on, it's probably not impacting your picks. We're okay with that. But by Wednesday, please. And some of you guys are competing with us. But Brad, you have chosen first Texas, then Ohio State, Alabama, Oregon, Penn State, Georgia, Boise State, and Miami so far. Feeling confident about those?
Oh, I took Miami last week.
Yes.
I
Well
didn't
done.
remember that.
Well done, Brad.
I
Yeah,
thought
good
I had
job.
dodged. I thought I had dodged the Canes. All right. Well, I would say the two I'm most worried about at this day. The one I'm most worried about is Miami. Second most is probably Georgia right now. So
Amazing to say. But
that
yeah.
is amazing to say. But yeah, I mean that they can't lose another one. So yeah, I am going to, even though they finally showed some signs this past weekend of maybe the pressure of the moment getting to them. This would be Indiana, who you picked last week. I'm going to throw Indiana on because they have 2 games remaining. They're 10-0. Everyone is expecting them to lose the next game. There's no pressure on them going into Columbus. They're going to be more than likely a double-digit underdog. No one's given them a chance. And even if they lose that game by 3 touchdowns, I don't think it kills them. Their final game is at home against Purdue, which should be an absolute bloodbath. So Indiana is going to be in the clubhouse at 11-1 worst case. And I think that'll be enough given what we see elsewhere. And the fact that, as we've discussed, other than this past weekend against Michigan, they have passed the eye test. They have beaten lesser teams by the amounts that they should beat them. And I think the committee should respect that if it comes down to really putting them under the microscope against other teams for an at-large spot. So I'm going to go with Indiana, which, by the way, is my 4th Big Ten team. And I believe you also have 4 Big Ten teams already.
Yeah, I'm Big Ten
Same
out.
4. Yeah.
Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, Iowa State, which was not really my pick, but I'm stuck. And that's the first one I know is not going to make the playoff unless craziness happens. Thank you, Jonathan Howe. I missed, but that's what happens when you go on a mission trip. You're trying to serve the Lord, and Jonathan Howe picks Iowa State for you. Well done.
You get submarined. Yep.
Indiana, I chose last week. I still feel good about that, despite what they did, how they eked it out versus Michigan. And now I've got to pick. Now it gets hard. It gets hard. I don't have Miami. Now is not the time to pick Miami. So I've been toying with BYU or Notre Dame. And BYU doesn't inspire confidence in me. I'm not convinced that they make it through unscathed. I'm going to pick Notre Dame now, taking an at-large spot, which is obviously what Notre Dame has to do. So I'm going to go with Notre Dame. That's who I'm choosing.
All right. Yeah, I mean,
terrible loss, but it looks like the team that has overcome the Northern Illinois loss in terms of they're playing a lot better than that every week. So.
Yeah, and look, and I know this sounds weird to some people for me to be completely writing off the 9-0 number 16 team in the AP poll and Army, but I don't think Army's a threat to Notre Dame. I think USC. That's the reason I have not picked Notre Dame yet is the game at USC looming at the end. Obviously, Notre Dame's better than USC, but USC has enough talent that I just. That game kind of worries me if I'm Notre Dame. I don't know. I don't know, but that's why I've held off to this point. But you have put yourself out there, and I mean Notre Dame's gonna be favored. There's no question about that. They're gonna be favored.
I got Iowa State. All right, we got to take a break, get to halftime,
well, let's do it.
Come back, and we're going to talk faith in Christ in the second half. We'll be right back.
Welcome back into the second half of Gridiron and the Gospel, a faith and college football podcast. I'm Brad Edwards along with George Schroeder, and this is where we talk about our faith in Jesus, the second half. And we always started off with our favorite segment, George.
That's right. Exactly right. It's called On My Heart, and it's as simple as the title sounds. The title is descriptive, okay? We just share each week something that God has placed, we believe, on our heart, something that about our faith in Christ that God's placed on our heart. And this week, we kind of alternate. It's not always worked that way, but this week it's your week to share what's on your heart. So, Brad, what's on your heart?
Yeah, this is pretty simple and straightforward. I think it's something that probably a lot of people are thinking about, which is post-election. We have, no secret, a very divided country, and we need to come together. And whether this is post-election, pre-election, right in the middle of someone's presidential term, it really makes no difference. Our job as Christians, or our role as Christians, is to be bringing people to Jesus. And because of that, that means bringing people together with each other, right?
Yep.
I mean,
Mhm.
it's whether you want to cite Jesus saying by this they will know that you're my disciples, that you love one another, or whether you say it's Jesus saying love your enemies, whichever way you want to approach it. um, those of us who have been involved in the political aspects of everything over the last few months, it's time to step out of that. I'm not saying like, okay, that we have to stop concerning ourselves with all things political, but I think it's very important at this stage that we really focus on how we can come together. And if Christians can't do that, then nobody's going to be able to do it. And so I think it's important for us to just kind of take a leadership role as churches within our communities, and each one of us individually to ask, what can I do to contribute to that? In what ways can I love my neighbor? And it's very easy to work with people who you think have common ground with you and agree with you on a lot of different things. But obviously, that's not what the Great Commission is all about, is going out there and finding the people that you have the most in common with and try to tell them about Jesus and try to see what you can do to help them. It involves much more than that. And so, George, I mean, to me, it really is as simple as that, which is what can we do within our own space, kind of, where you're planted. How can you be a force for bringing people together in your community? What can you do to do good instead of contributing more to just kind of pushing people apart, which we've had way too much of? And look, I'm not even saying it's restricted to the past 4 years, because obviously for quite some time, this is something that we've all been dealing with. And I think for quite some time, we would pretty much agree that the church needs to be a bigger factor in healing within our communities.
Well, I'd agree with that. And I think it starts with a couple of things. And so I appreciate that's what's on your heart, Brad. It starts with a couple of things. One, recognize that God is the one, regardless of whether the candidate you voted for won, if you voted for President Trump, President-elect Trump, or if you voted for Vice President Harris and she lost, or whatever race we're talking about at any level. God's the one who sets up leaders and puts them in positions of authority. And we're called to be subject to those leaders and to honor them. That'd be the first thing. Secondly, our purpose is to proclaim his excellencies.
Mm-hmm.
He took us out of darkness and into his marvelous light. And that's 1 Peter chapter 1 and 2. But the other thing is, I think, how can we bring people together? It's this, man. Why don't we pray? Why don't we pray? Paul wrote to Timothy in the first letter he wrote to Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 2, he writes, first of all, the very first thing I want you to do as you set up churches, Timothy, first of all, here's what churches should do. First of all, then, I urge that petitions, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone, for kings and all those who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. This is good, and it pleases God our Savior, who wants everyone to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. For there's one God and one mediator between God and mankind, the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for all, a testimony at the proper time. That, first of all, that last piece, that's the good news. That's the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
You were lost in your sin. You are lost in your sin if you don't have a relationship with Christ. But God, because he loves you so much, sent Jesus to die for you, so that if you'll turn from your sin and trust him for salvation and follow him, you'll be saved. And that's the gospel. There's one God, and then there's one mediator between God and mankind, Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom, a testimony. But Paul says to Timothy, first, pray for everyone. But he says for kings and all those who are in authority. So that would have included emperors like Nero in the Roman Empire, right? So regardless of whether your candidate won or didn't win, pray for that person. Pray for those people. Pray that they would enact policies that honor God. Pray for the peace of our country internally, right? But the reason we're supposed to pray, I find, is really interesting. In verse 2 here, you're supposed to pray for all these folks, the kings and all those who are in authority, so that, one, we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. Pray for those people so that we will have peace, so that we can be free and able to pursue a life of godliness. Just a quiet life. That's what we're looking for here. And then verse 3 talks about how it's a good thing. It pleases God that we would do that we would pray, and then probably that, I guess it would follow, and that we'd be able to lead this quiet, tranquil life of godliness, because God wants everyone to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. So all I'm going to say is this: if Christians are so fraught by lead-ups to elections and by results of elections, whether they're euphoric or can't, or just out of control, unhappy, that doesn't reflect a trust in God, and it doesn't shine the light of, wow, this gospel, this God is worth trusting. So, man, do you want to show God to people? Or do you want to show, I'm so wound up in politics, my nation, one way or the other? What do you want to show, Christian? That would be my challenge to you. So how can we promote peace? To go back to what you said, how can we promote peace? Well, I think it starts by praying. And hey, man, pray for the people who voted the other way than you did, right? And I'm not saying pray God will smite them.
Right. No, you're right. I think a lot of people like look at them as the enemy, right? People who disagree with you, they're the enemy. They're not.
They're not. Hey, some of those folks don't know Christ. And so that would, by definition, make them God's enemies, just like you were, if you're a Christ follower, before you came to Christ.
Right.
But they're not your enemies. They're made in God's image. And they need him, just like you did if you're a Christ follower, just like you do if you don't know Jesus. We want you to know Jesus, by the way. We want you to understand this faith that you and I share. And we would love for you to reach out to us, by the way, for that. But they need to know Jesus. And I want to say one more thing. It isn't just the guy on the other side of the aisle who needs Jesus. It's a whole lot of the people on the same side of the political aisle as you need Jesus.
Right.
And they're God's enemies, not yours, and they need him. And so, man, how can we about getting the gospel to people? Well, it starts with us promoting peace.
Yeah. So one other thought that occurs to me, and I know everyone loves to look at election results and try to make some deductions, right, as to exactly what did that vote mean? Like what is this signal? And I think one of the things that's been talked about a lot is a distrust in institutions, whether that be government, whether it be the media. There are a lot of things that people seem to have a lot less trust in, if not have completely lost trust in, that previously they did. And if that's the case, we all need to have trust in something, right? And for these people who have kind of lost trust in some of these things they previously counted on, what do they put their trust in now? And I think the bigger question, obviously, for us is, who do they put their trust in? Do you put it in a president? Or do you realize, like, in the grand scheme of things, no person on this earth is worth putting your trust in? Yes, occasionally we do have to trust each other, but there's only one that we can trust, and that's Jesus. And I think with knowing that Jesus is the answer for every one of us, that's where we need to go. And that needs to, I was pun intended, that needs to trump politics, right?
That's right.
And so that's where we are right now. And as I said, George, that's what's on my heart this week. And I think it's something that a lot of Christians hopefully have been thinking about.
Yeah, listen, I pray that. Look, we definitely need healing as a nation, and Christ is the healer. So let's work towards that as Christians. Let's work toward that together, rather than vilifying, demonizing the people on the other side, whether they're winners or losers in the election. So, all right, well, that's about all the time we got. We need to go ahead and wrap this thing. So, but if you want to have a conversation with us, as it relates to anything football. But man, we would love to talk with you about life and the potential for new life in Christ. We'd love to talk with you about that. You can find us, reach out at gridirongospelpod@gmail.com, or reach out on Twitter. He's at J. Brad Edwards, and I'm at George Schroeder. Really easy to find us there. And you can visit us online too at gridironandthegospel.com, and you can find the show itself on Twitter or Instagram at gridiron_gospel.
And if you have any questions about why George has Iowa State on his list of playoff picks, you can email Jonathan Howe. No, I'm just kidding. Be sure to.
I messed with George at gmail.com, I think is what it is.
Well, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe in your favorite podcast app. We're on all the major podcasting platforms. Just search for Gridiron and the Gospel, or follow the links on the show website.
Yeah, if you'd like to partner with Gridiron and the Gospel, we'd love to explore that with you for sure. So go ahead and hit us up at the email, gridirongospelpod@gmail.com. Look forward to that. And that would be great to talk with you about.
Tune in next week for more Gridiron and the Gospel, a faith and college football podcast.